What if I told you one single question just shattered a 20-year family narrative in under 60 seconds? And the man at the center of it did not even realize he was confessing everything on national television. When he was asked about favoritism, he did not deny it. He ranked his ex-wives by respect, and what he revealed changes the way you will see every past season. If you want the real breakdown without the spin, hit subscribe right now, because we expose what others miss. And trust me, you are going to want to hear how this story really unfolds. The studio lights felt hotter than usual as the questions settled into the room. And even before he began to answer, there was a tension that hinted something irreversible was about to unfold. Because for years, viewers had debated favoritism, whispered about unequal affection, and analyzed every holiday, every anniversary, every family gathering, searching for proof. And now, in a single, unexpected moment, the topic could no longer be avoided. He leaned back in his chair, appearing calm, almost thoughtful, and began explaining that respect was the foundation of everything. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing words that might soften what was coming next. But instead of diffusing speculation, he confirmed it by describing levels of respect among the women he had once called equal partners. He said he respected one more than another, and another more than the next, and as soon as those words were spoken, the illusion of balance shattered. Because ranking respect is not a neutral act. It reveals preference, it exposes hierarchy, and it rewrites history in real time. Viewers watching at home felt that shift immediately because suddenly past seasons replayed in their minds with sharper clarity. The extra nights spent in one home, the postponed visits to another, the financial decisions that seemed practical at the time but now appeared partial, the emotional conversations that ended in frustration rather than resolution. All of it began to form a new pattern, and the suspense of the moment did not rely on raised voices or dramatic music. It relied on the quiet realization that what had long been denied was now acknowledged openly. He framed his answer as honesty, as self-reflection, as growth. But beneath that framing was an admission that equality had not been fully practiced. And as he continued, he described feeling misunderstood, feeling judged for loving deeply, feeling accused of favoritism when, in his view, he had simply followed his heart. Yet the more he justified, the clearer it became that his heart had guided him unevenly, and that unevenness had consequences. Because in relationships built on shared ideals, perception matters as much as intention. And if three women experienced distance while one experienced closeness, then perception becomes reality over time. The host listened without interruption, allowing him space to elaborate. And in that space, he described moments of conflict, moments when he believed someone had offended him, and moments when he chose to react rather than release resentment. And he admitted that perhaps he should have let certain things go. Perhaps he should have responded with more patience. Yet even in that admission, there lingered a tone of self-defense, as though the circumstances had pushed him toward decisions rather than his own agency. And viewers sensed that tension between accountability and explanation, because true accountability centers on choice, while explanation often leans on circumstance. And as he spoke about respect being earned through loyalty, through agreement, through alignment with his vision, the audience began to understand that his definition of respect might not match what others expected in a marriage. For some, respect means emotional availability, consistency, partnership. But for him, it seemed intertwined with harmony and lack of resistance. And that distinction added another layer to the unfolding narrative. Because if respect increases when there is less challenge, then those who asked more of him, who sought deeper connection, who voiced dissatisfaction, may have been unconsciously downgraded in his internal hierarchy. And that realization cast past disagreements in a new light. Scenes once framed as emotional volatility now appeared as unmet needs. Scenes once described as rebellion now felt like pleas for reciprocity. And as the conversation progressed, he shifted toward describing a spiritual bond he believed existed uniquely in his current marriage. He spoke of divine alignment, of shared purpose, of feeling elevated rather than burdened. And while he intended this as affirmation, it inevitably highlighted contrast. Because elevating one relationship suggests others did not reach that same level. And the tension in the room grew not through confrontation, but through implication, because implication invites viewers to fill gaps themselves, and audiences are often more moved by what is implied than by what is shouted. And across social platforms, clips of the moment began circulating almost instantly, sparking discussion not rooted in hostility, but in astonishment. Because many had defended him for years, arguing that editing shaped perception, that circumstances during global challenges complicated family logistics, that misunderstandings were mutual, yet the ranking of respect offered clarity that editing could not manufacture. It was his own articulation, and therefore carried weight that speculation never could. And perhaps the most compelling aspect of the moment was his apparent belief that honesty would absolve rather than complicate. He seemed to think that stating his internal order would demonstrate transparency, yet transparency without sensitivity can feel stark. And in families, especially large interconnected families, words reverberate far beyond their initial context. Children hear them, former partners interpret them, extended relatives reflect on them, and viewers archive them. And once spoken, they cannot be retracted. They become part of the permanent narrative, shaping how every previous and future event is understood. And as he continued discussing past conflicts, he described moments of perceived betrayal, moments when he felt under attack, moments when he believed someone had drawn first blood. And in those descriptions, he positioned himself as reactive rather than initiating, and that framing subtly redirected responsibility, yet it also reveals a pattern of holding on to offense rather than seeking repair. And repair requires humility, which rarely fits comfortably alongside hierarchy. And as viewers considered this dynamic, they began asking deeper questions about what equality truly requires in plural marriage structures, whether equal time, equal resources, equal affection are possible without intentional discipline, and whether unexamined preference inevitably expands over years into structural imbalance. And the suspense now extended beyond the episode, because the confession would influence legal negotiations, financial discussions, and family communication moving forward. It would likely surface in future interviews, referenced in future disagreements, and replayed in future retrospectives. And each replay would reinforce the reality that the hierarchy had been spoken aloud. And while some might interpret his candor as refreshing, others viewed it as confirmation of long-standing concerns. And that divergence of interpretation ensures that conversation will continue, because narratives rarely settle immediately. They evolve through dialogue, through reflection, through lived consequences. And perhaps the most poignant aspect of the moment lies in its simplicity. A single question about favoritism, a single answer about respect, and a cascade of re-evaluation that followed, proving that sometimes the most dramatic revelations arrive not through spectacle, but through calm, unguarded honesty that reshapes everything that came before and everything that follows. As the episode continued, the impact of that admission did not fade. It expanded, because once hierarchy is introduced into a story built on equality, every memory becomes evidence, and every past conversation gains new meaning. Viewers began revisiting earlier seasons, noticing how often one home seemed filled with laughter, while another carried tension. Noticing how quickly certain concerns were dismissed, while others were handled with patience and reassurance. And this retrospective analysis created a second wave of suspense, not about what would be said next, but about what had already been said years ago that now sounded different through the lens of ranked respect. And while he maintained that love had existed for each relationship, he also implied that compatibility, alignment, and loyalty had influenced his emotional investment. And that subtle distinction mattered, because love in theory can be equal, yet in practice it can be distributed unevenly, especially when daily choices reveal preference more loudly than declarations. And as he defended his past decisions, he spoke about feeling criticized for loving openly, about feeling judged for choosing peace where he found it. And in doing so, he positioned himself as someone punished for authenticity. Yet authenticity without balance can create isolation, and isolation had already become visible in the family structure, with adult children expressing distance, former partners establishing independence, and communication channels narrowing over time. And although he framed the ranking as simple honesty, the emotional ripple was anything but simple, because respect, when publicly measured, becomes a benchmark, and benchmarks inevitably invite comparison, and comparison often deepens divides rather than mending them. And the suspense tightened further when the conversation shifted toward the idea of divine connection, because elevating one relationship spiritually suggests transcendence, while the others remain grounded. And that language, although heartfelt, introduced a symbolic separation between past and present, almost as though prior marriages were steps toward a final destination, rather than enduring commitments in their own right. And this reframing subtly minimized decades of shared history, sacrifices, relocations, financial pooling, and child-rearing that required cooperation and trust. And while he may have intended to express gratitude for where he stands now, the phrasing inadvertently underscored why others felt overlooked. Because when one bond is described as higher, it inevitably casts shadows on those described as lesser. And viewers sensed that tension, especially those who had watched the early seasons, filled with optimism about plural unity, shared meals, group decisions, and collaborative parenting, and now contrasted that optimism with the present reality of fragmentation and individual paths. And the women who had once described sisterhood now navigated separate states, separate homes, separate routines, each carving out identity beyond the family structure. And as their post-marriage journeys unfolded, they appeared steadier, more self-assured, and increasingly candid about unmet expectations, which only intensified the weight of his ranking, because it validated feelings they had articulated in softer terms years earlier. And perhaps the most striking element of Part 2 was not any single statement, but the accumulation of them, because each clarification layered onto the last, creating a mosaic of perspective that painted preference as organic rather than intentional. Yet outcomes rarely distinguish between organic and deliberate when the result is imbalance, and imbalance over time erodes trust. And once trust erodes, distance grows. And that distance was evident not only between former spouses, but between father and children, who now evaluate their upbringing through adult understanding. And although he expressed hope for reconciliation, hope alone does not dissolve recorded admissions, especially when those admissions confirm lived experiences. And the conversation around accountability remained nuanced, because he acknowledged moments where he could have responded differently, where pride influenced reaction, where frustration shaped tone. Yet the overall narrative still leaned toward explanation rather than ownership. And audiences are perceptive. They recognize the difference between saying, "I could have handled that better," and saying, "I was wrong." And that distinction shapes whether viewers interpret vulnerability as growth or as partial concession. And meanwhile, social commentary flourished, not as outrage, but as analysis. Experts on family dynamics weighed in, discussing how hierarchy in plural systems requires extraordinary discipline to prevent favoritism, and how without explicit safeguards, emotional gravity will naturally pull toward the most harmonious connection. And harmony itself can be subjective, influenced by agreement, by shared worldview, by mutual reinforcement. And if one partnership offered consistent affirmation while others challenged inconsistencies, then it becomes understandable, though not necessarily equitable, that comfort would concentrate in that space. And this psychological layer deepened the suspense because it suggested the unraveling was not sudden, but cumulative, built through years of small choices that gradually solidified into structural separation. And as part 2 drew toward its close, the overarching question lingered, whether this candid ranking marks the beginning of deeper reflection or simply a final confirmation of divergent paths. Because transparency can either bridge gaps or finalize divides, depending on how it is followed. And for viewers, the investment remains not in conflict, but in resolution, in seeing whether acknowledgement leads to genuine dialogue, whether relationships with children can be rebuilt on clearer foundations, whether former partners can coexist respectfully without revisiting past hierarchies, and whether he himself will reassess what respect truly means beyond loyalty and agreement toward empathy and shared responsibility. And that is where the narrative now stands, suspended between past and future, between explanation and accountability, between preference and partnership. And until those tensions are resolved, the story remains open-ended, looping back to that initial question about favoritism that seemed simple, yet unlocked a cascade of reflection that continues to ripple outward, ensuring that this moment will not be remembered for volume or spectacle, but for the quiet gravity of words that once spoken cannot be unspoken, and whose implications will echo in every chapter still to come. In the end, it was not the arguments or the headlines that changed everything. It was one calm answer that exposed years of imbalance and confirmed what viewers had suspected all along. A single ranking reshaped the entire story, and the consequences are still unfolding. If you want the full truth behind every tell-all moment and the deeper analysis no one else is catching, make sure you subscribe right now, because this story is far from over, and you do not want to miss what comes next.